a direct indication of where we are right now with our country. The first thing is, what is the source of the quarrels and conflicts amongst you? What's causing all the problem? Well, even without the protests and the riots and all the other things that are going on, even if we took that out of this situation, what does our country look like right now? Everybody's picking sides and pointing fingers at each other. Problems between the pandemic and the politics, and now the protests and the looting. There is nothing but fighting. Like I said, I talked to a young person this week who was kind of struggling with this stuff, and what do I do to get out of this funk that I'm in? What do I do to get out of this feeling that I said, well, first of all, shut off the news. If you want to check it out, check it in the morning. Leave it alone all day long. Don't listen to it on the radio. Don't watch it on television. Shut it off. You want to check it again right before you go to bed, do it then. But if you spend all day listening to the fighting and the quarreling and all that kind of stuff, it's going to be like getting punched over and over and over again all day, and you have to walk away from that. I think the most damaging thing that has gotten to our country in a long time is a 24-hour news cycle, where people can watch the news 24 hours, because to fill it, they fill it with opinion, and they fill it with all these so-called experts and talking heads that are constantly going back and forth, and that bickering and yelling and fighting is not doing anybody any good. We're not gaining from that, we're losing from that. And we're seeing the manifestation of that now in behavior and the way people are acting. And as all these quarrelings go on, why is it happening? Well, James tells us right out there. Is it not because you find pleasure in that? Waging war on each other, don't you? Isn't it that you just enjoy that? If you're on Facebook and you look at how people are attacking friends and family members right now, and the back and forth and the negativity, no one can have a constructive conversation anymore. Now it's all accusations and fighting and back and forth. He says, you lust and do not have. Pete, back it up one more. You lust and do not have, so you commit murder. Okay? Anybody see on TV the people burning down buildings and breaking into buildings and stealing stuff? It's in the middle of a protest, so you're protesting someone's behavior towards someone else. And protesting is something that's legal and it's right in our country. We have the right, under the freedom of speech, for peaceful assembly. But if you take that anger that you have about a topic and then turn around and use it to break into stores and steal everything out of there, then it's not about what the topic was. It's just about stealing for your own good. It's because you lust and don't have. You're envious and cannot obtain, so you fight about it and you quarrel. And he says all you have to do is ask with the right motives. If you're asking with the wrong motives, then don't expect to get the answer you want. You have to ask with the right motives. Now these are all things that we should know. Like I said, James is speaking to the church. He's speaking to believers. These are things that we should know already. And yet he feels it necessary to remind us. And when I look at, and this was, when he wrote this 2,000 years ago, apparently it was enough of an issue he had to address it. But I find it just as applicable now, if not more so, in that we need to be addressed on this stuff too. Our own country needs to be addressed on this. Until we can turn back to God with the right motives and the right way of doing it, I don't see change in our country. I don't see change coming up at all. James 1:4 then says, you adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is hostility towards God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Very clearly, it is stated in the Bible in many different ways. It's stated about picking one side over the other. And it's interesting, this term he uses, adulteresses. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means somebody who is supposed to be committed to one thing and is sneaking around and cheating on the other. That's a very appropriate analogy for him to be using about God's people, if God's people are in the world. If you're of the world, if you are more concerned about the world, if politics concerns you more than love, if these things that are happening in our country are causing you to separate yourself from other people, whether they're people that believe the same as you or people that don't, whether they're people that agree or people that disagree, if as Christians we cannot overcome that with God's love, then we're sneaking around and going over to the world side. And when we do that, we're going against God. I mean, that plain and simple, that's what this ends up being. And if you wish to be a friend of the world, then you're alienating God. You're separating yourself from God. You're divided. You have divided loyalties. Now, what James says, in most of what he says here, and especially this, you will never see on a t-shirt. This is not bumper sticker material. This is not touchy-feely, happy things. He is calling out the concept of the fact that we have a two-minded society. That in church I'm this person, online I'm this person. In church I'm like this, when I'm having coffee downtown I'm like this. He says that's adultery. That's what he calls it. He calls it adultery. Which is something that, turns our stomach. We don't like that concept. But God will not accept that. You cannot expect God to put up with that kind of behavior. That's not acceptable. Ezekiel 16:32 says, "You adulterous wife who takes strangers instead of her husband." He was talking, again, in Ezekiel, he's talking about this double-mindedness. And Jesus himself said, "For he who is not against us is for us." You can't be both. You can't be on both sides at the same time. You have to pick a side. And God says, I'm not going to accept part-time belief. I'm not going to accept partial faith. Either you are or you aren't. You cannot be in the middle. So he goes on in James 4:5 and says, "Or do you think that the scripture speaks to no purpose?" And these are in quotes. He says, "He jealously desires the Spirit which he has made to dwell in us." Now this is an interesting statement. And Jane and I talked about it, and I studied it, and I looked at different commentaries. This one verse has a lot of theological people stumped. Because it's hard to look at and figure it out. And some people go one way on this verse, some people go other ways on this verse. But first of all, I'm not going to go into all the different theology about some of this stuff, but I want us to look at that second word in the second line. Jealousy is something we normally have a negative connotation with. Jealousy is normally something that we don't look at as being a positive. But it's different in this context. And we have to remember what James just said in the previous verse. In James 4, he was talking about adulteress. Now he's talking about this. God desires our whole heart, everything, 100% commitment. That is your life, that is your body, that is your mind, that is your speech, that is all of those things are inclusive. And God desires it in a jealous way. And again, James here is talking to believers, and he says, God, don't you understand what the scripture says? That God desires the Spirit which he has made to dwell in you. So when we look at this from an English teacher's perspective, we have he, which we know he's talking about God. He desires and he made. He desires that Spirit. He desires what he put into us, what we were created for, what we were intended for. He desires that love from us. And he made it and put it into us for that purpose. Now, a really good description of this, Pete, and I wrote this down. I have a quote here from John Piper. He says, God's jealousy is not the reflex of weakness or fear. Instead, God is jealous like a powerful and merciful king who takes a peasant girl from a life of shame, forgives her, marries her, and gives her not the chores of a slave, but the privileges of a wife, a queen. His jealousy does not rise from fear or weakness, but from a holy indignation. and having his honor and power and mercy scorned by the faithlessness of a fickle spouse. That's the best description I could find on that, on this verse.
Good.
And think about what that is for us. We have been bought and paid for at a price beyond anything we could even imagine. The Father sent the Son to die for us. He was crucified. He was beaten. He was scorned. He was cursed. And in the end, he died painfully for us. And there was no justification for that at all from a worldly perspective. But God did that because he loved us so much. So we are bought and paid for at a very high price. Now, knowing that as Christians, James talking to the Christians, knowing that as Christians, what excuse do we have to squander that? What excuse do we have to cheat on that? To slide around the side on that? Nothing. So when he says, that scripture says that God is jealous, that's what God's jealous about. Because we're fighting against what he freely gave us. He gave us the most perfect and beautiful concept in the world. When the gospel was laid out before us, we have received everything we could possibly need. So why would we cheat on that and go around the side? James 4:6 says, and this is the gospel in a nutshell right here, but he gives a greater grace. Therefore it says, God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. This is the gospel, and this is the choice we have. John 3:16.
You know John 3:16?
Everybody knows John 3:16, right? Can you say it?
I believe I say John 3:16 for God for what you say it. You say it.
Can you say it for us? No. He's not going to say it. Well, have Grandpa say it then. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him. Okay, now that we have a lot stated in that already. First of all, God loves us so much that he gave his Son, number one. Number two, whoever believes in him. Okay, there's a choice. You have a choice to believe or not believe. God gives us that choice. And that choice comes with the humility of understanding that we're receiving something that we don't earn. But the blessing of the gospel is, after hearing that we're adulteresses, after hearing of all the things that we're doing wrong, James brings us out and says, but God gives a greater grace. You might stumble, but God is still there waiting for you to come back. God is always waiting for that concept to bring things back together. Romans 5:20 says, the law came in so that transgression would increase. But where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. That is the gospel in a nutshell. God's grace is so much more than your sin. Whatever your sin is, God's grace covers that. And not by just a little bit. I was reading one person's commentary on this, and he said, it's like a horse race. Grace and sin, God's grace and our sin is not a photo finish. It's like Secretariat. It's winning by the entire course. God's grace is way beyond what we can imagine. So if someone is not a believer and they think that they can't be saved, they're wrong, because God says, my grace is more than sufficient. It is more than what you could possibly need. Grace is beyond that. And James is saying, you're wrong, but God still wants you back. Now, he is a hellfire and brimstone preacher. When James is talking, he's not pulling any punches. But in addition to not pulling any punches about what's wrong, he's not pulling any punches about what's right either. And he says, if you are humble, God gives grace to the humble. Okay? Pride is one of the biggest problems I think we have in our country right now. Everybody who's arguing on either side, it's all about pride. Even when they're wrong, will they admit it? Even when you can prove they're wrong, they still won't admit it. They won't change their beliefs. They get stuck and put that stick in the ground, and as Mr. B would always say, you know, that's not the hill I want to die on. People are dying on hills theologically, emotionally. They're dying on hills that don't make any sense at all, that aren't really hills. They're picking a position that they were willing to alienate friends, family, church members over something that's not important enough for us to even argue about. But it's enough for people to fight about if they want to. And that comes from pride. That comes 100% from pride. James 4:7 then, submit therefore to God. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. I had an old retired pastor that every time we hit that word, he said, anytime you're reading the Bible and it says therefore, pay really close attention. Why is therefore, what is therefore there for? It's because at this point in time, that is a command. When it says therefore, he's going to tell you what you should do. Here's the application that James brings out about this. What are you supposed to do about these things? And he says, submit therefore to God. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. I love this concept because if you look at the word resist that James uses in Greek in the original translation, it did not mean defensive. The devil will not flee from defensive resistance. He's not going to run away from somebody that boards himself up in a castle and hides. That's not what he's talking about. James says, resist in an active way. Draw your sword and charge at him. He'll run away. Be active. Go after it. When you resist the devil, do it proactively. Have a battle plan and go for it. If you know that there's something in your life that is blocking you from God, attack it. Don't just ignore it. Don't just try to defend it. Attack it. Go after it. I remember there was a movie when I was a kid, and I don't remember what the name of it was. I think it was My Bodyguard. It was about a kid that was getting beat up in school, and he hires this great big guy to be his bodyguard. And you see, as the movie progresses, at first the bodyguard steps in and handles things for him. And then the bodyguard steps back and lets the kid handle things for himself. Which is not that hard if you got the big guy standing behind you, right? You can look up at somebody and yell at him if he's got to look up at the guy standing behind you and you know he's going to back you up. And eventually, he does it without anybody standing behind him. He can just stand up for himself. And God is standing behind us. When we're resisting the devil, he gives us everything we need. He puts it in his word. You go into Ephesians and you look at the full armor of God. What's the sword? What is the aggressive thing? What is the sword in the full armor of God? Anybody know what that is?
Word of God.
It is the actual word of God. God armed us with an offensive weapon to be used against Satan. That is the purpose of it. So when he says resist Satan, he means go get him. Chase him off. Don't let him get into your life. Don't let him get into your brain. Don't let him pick at you. Go at it. If you know there's a weakness you have, attack that weakness. Make it stronger. When we're lifting and the powerlifting crew's working and we're working out in the gym, if you have a weak spot, if there is one lift that is a problem for you, you don't ignore it. You focus on it. You may take some attention away from the things that are going good just to focus on the stuff that's going bad until it catches up and you get back to where you should be. That's what God's saying here. Resist and he will flee. People. Luke 9:23. Jesus said, and he was saying to them all, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. This is the same concept that James is talking about when he says, resist the devil and he will flee you. Jesus says, if you're my follower, you pick up your cross every single day to follow me. That's an offensive thing. That's not defense. That's offense. You pick up whatever cross you have and you follow him every single day. Not on Sunday, not just on Saturday, every day of every week of every year. Be offensive. Be offensive against Satan. Take it to him. Because otherwise, we're going to slip and we're going to fall. Okay. Now James 4:8 says, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Remember how I said nothing, that the book of James fits our time more than anything else? Well, first of all, it says, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Just like John 3:16 said, you have a choice for those who believe in him. If that's who you are, and you are fighting against the devil, and you are separating yourself from the world, and you are trying to get closer to God, he's going to draw closer to you. How do you hear from God? You listen. You read the Word. The more you listen, the more you read the Word, the more you're going to hear from God. It's that simple. But in addition, he says, cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Doesn't that fit our day and time? How many times do you see something somewhere saying, you need to wash your hands, you need to wash your hands? What, 20 seconds, right? They even give you the songs you're supposed to sing to make it 20 seconds long. The one I thought that was the most interesting is there's a song from REM called The End of the World as We Know It. Well, how depressing is that? I'm going to sing that while I wash my hands. But we talk about that all the time. Well, I want to bring something up here I think is kind of interesting. The Bible talks about hand washing too. The Bible talks about hand washing in 3 different instances and for 3 different purposes. First one's sanitation. Kind of like what we're dealing with right now. Leviticus 15:11 says, likewise, whoever the one with the discharge touches without having rinsed his hands in water shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. Now, talking about ailments of the skin, things like that. If you come in contact with somebody like that, you got to wash your clothes, wash your hands, wash everything. If you knew that you ran into somebody with COVID-19, what would they tell you to do? First thing is, wash everything up. If you talk to someone who is working in healthcare right now, what do they have to do? They shower, they change their clothes, they do all those kind of things before they ever go home. Every day. They're showering and changing in hospitals. I listened to one doctor explain how he was doing. He had young kids at home. He would shower and change in a section of the house that the kids aren't allowed into anymore. And he would stay in that section of the house. Just to make sure everything, all the contact surfaces are clean. It's the same thing we're doing right now. God was telling this to the Israelites back in Exodus to do these things. Okay? Another one, Leviticus 15:13 says, now when the man with discharge becomes cleansed from his discharge, he shall count off for himself 7 days from his cleansing. He shall then wash his clothes and bathe his body in running water and will become clean. Well, CDC says 14, but the Bible in this case is saying 7. Is this not quarantine? Is this not the same thing we're seeing right now? Okay? And it's interesting, it says, in running water. It was not until the 1800s that surgically in our medical professions did they understand that running water was necessary for cleanliness. If you just put it in a bowl and wash your hands in it, you just take the nasty stuff and you swirl it around your hands and go back. Eventually, Lister came up with the concept of disinfectant and carbolic acid being used as a disinfectant, the guy who Listerine is named after. That wasn't until the 1800s that happened. So doctors would be spreading disease from one patient to another because they weren't washing their hands under running water. And 2,000 years ago, God said to do that. Now, another way the Bible brings up washing your hands is for separation. And how many times have you heard someone say, I'm just washing my hands of the whole mess? What comes from this? And the one we know the best is in Matthew. And that's Pilate. When Pilate saw that he was accomplishing nothing, but rather that a riot was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd, saying, I'm innocent of this man's blood, see to that yourselves. Now, that's kind of a cowardly thing for him to do because he was the one that was passing judgment, and he wasn't taking personal responsibility for it. But what was happening here was him in front of the crowd saying, this is on you. And when he does that kind of thing, I think I lost my mic here, I'm just going to speak up. When he does that kind of thing and he's talking about cleansing his hands, it's distancing. I'm separating myself from you. And remember, James said, cleanse your hands. Cleanse your hands and purify your heart. Well, there's a better example of distancing here, talking about cleansing. And that is in Psalm 26. Psalm 26, 5 through 6 says, I hate the assembly of evildoers. I will not sit with the wicked. I shall wash my hands in innocence, and I will go about your altar, O Lord. So in Psalms, David's talking about, in this particular passage, David is talking about separating himself from evil. He's going to separate himself from evil. That's his wash. I'm going to wash my hands of the evildoers. Wash my hands in innocence. I'm going to separate myself from all of that. Again, that's applicable to our time. That's applicable to what James is saying. Now, the third example of hand washing is sanctification. And we know what sanctification is. Sanctification is the developing in our lives, in our faith walk, getting closer and closer to God. Closer and closer to who we are intended to be. That's sanctification. In Exodus again, this is God's commands given through Moses to the Israelites. He says, you will also make a laver of bronze with its base of bronze for washing. And you shall put it between the tent of meeting and the altar. And you shall put water in it. Aaron and his sons shall wash their hands and their feet from it. When they enter the tent of meeting, they shall wash with the water, so that they will not die. And when they approach the altar to minister by offering up in smoke a sacrifice to the Lord. In other words, the priests at that time could go from the communal area, the tent of meeting where everybody got together, and they were going to take their sacrifices to God. And God said, you clean yourself before you come before me. You could be in this big group with everybody else, but if you're going to come to me, clean up first. And he even puts this onto them so that they will not die. That's sanctification there. He says you get yourself ready to meet God before you meet God. Another example, again, going back to Psalms. Who may ascend to the hill of the Lord, and who may stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who has not lifted up his soul to falsehood, has not sworn deceitfully. James has taken everything he's talking about right here from this passage. Who's going to go to the hill of the Lord? Those who have clean hands and a pure heart. So when James says, wash your hands and purify your heart, I think he's probably directly referring to this passage from Psalms. That's just my personal beliefs. James never wrote down where his inspiration was from. So we're talking about cleansing ourselves and cleansing our hands. What is that? That's an intentional action you take to clean up your act. So James is saying, here's what's happening, but God's grace is bigger than that. He wants you back. He's jealous for you. He wants to grab you back. So what do you got to do? Clean up your act. Wash your hands, purify your heart, get yourself ready to go back and meet God. And now James says in verses 9 and 10, he says, be miserable and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned into mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves in the presence of the Lord and he will exalt you. Now this is an interesting passage as well because it says be miserable. What are we supposed to be miserable about? We're supposed to be miserable about that separation from God that we caused. When you recognize who you are and who he is, when you step forward and say, hey, this has been my fault, that's where you start to humble yourself. You're not blaming it on somebody else. You're not blaming it on God. You're not blaming it on anything else in the world. You are owning it and saying, this was me. I did this. That's where we start. When that happens, and you acknowledge that, you're going to understand what that miserableness and mourning is. You're going to understand what he's talking about there. And he says, humble yourselves in the presence of the Lord and he will exalt you. One of my favorite parables of Jesus, because I feel personally it applies to me so much, is the prodigal son. And if you look at the prodigal son, you will see an example of God's love in the Father, and you will see an example of God's children in the sons. The prodigal son himself, in his pride, walked away from his father. In his pride, he said, I don't need you. Just give me my money and I'll take off. And then we know what he did. He went out and he partied and lived it up, and he had all the things he wanted in life. But it was only for a short period of time, and then it was gone. And he had nothing left. So what could he have done? Well, he could have just died. He could have just laid down and died and said, I'm done. What did he do, though? He came back, he realized who the Father was and what he had left behind and what he had lost. The prodigal son realized what had been missing in his life was his father, and then he needed to get back there. And he realized that even at the lowest level of servant, someone who just feeds the pigs, it would be better than being separated from the Father, so he came back to the Father. And when James says we should clean our hands and purify our heart, he's talking about these things, humbling ourselves in the presence of the Lord. What does the Father do when the prodigal son returns? Remember that previous verse that said, draw near to him and he'll draw near to you? As soon as the Father saw this lost son coming towards him, he ran to the son. As soon as the possibility of reunion became possible, the Father ran to him, threw his arms around him, was so happy to have him back. He celebrated having him back. God's waiting for us to come back with open arms. That's where his grace abounds beyond our sin. But that choice still has to be ours, and that's what James is talking about here. It was your choice to sin. It was your choice to go with the world instead of with God. But God's waiting for you to make the choice to come back to him. Yes, it's hard to hear all the things you're doing wrong. Nobody likes to hear that. Nobody likes to hear that. Nobody likes to make a list of the things that they do wrong. Ask your kids. Remember growing up Catholic, going to a Catholic school, every week we had confession. Every kid in the school went to confession every week. What a kindergartner has to confess every week, I'm not sure. Usually it was I picked on my sister, I told a lie, I said a naughty word, something like that. But it was terrifying to sit there waiting to go into that confessional trying to come up with something. And it's one of those things where you knew you better come up with the right stuff or they're going to get after you because you weren't honest. But you don't want to tell too much because then you really get in trouble from somebody. It's a terrifying thing for a kid. It's the same thing with us. We don't really want to be confronted with what's in the mirror. That's a scary thing. We don't want to see with 20/20 vision our problems, but James is laying it all out here. He turns on the bright lights. I'm always amazed when I look in the mirror. This is me and my age again. When I look in the mirror at home in our bathroom, there's something about the lighting in our bathroom that's kind of yellowish. It's not very bright. And I'll go in and shave and everything. I think I'm good. Then I'll be on the way to school in my pickup or my car, and it's brighter. And I've got that mirror up there. And trust me, guys with age here will understand. You will see that hair in your ear that you did not see in the bathroom mirror when you're on your way someplace where you don't want to have that hair in your ear. Unless you grow giant beards and cover your ear with your beards, and then it doesn't count. But we are meant to humble ourselves by understanding who we are and who he is. Now, going into verses 11 and 12, we're wrapping up this chapter in James. He says, do not speak against one another, brethren. He who speaks against a brother and judges his brother speaks against the law, judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge of it. There's only one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and destroy. But who are you to judge your neighbor? What's the difference between God judging and man judging? What's the difference between us judging someone and God judging someone? He says it right there in that passage. Right there he says, there's only one lawgiver and judge because he can save and destroy. We cannot save someone. We can sure destroy them. So we're not supposed to be judges because we are destroyers in our judgment. But God can save through his judgment. We're not supposed to be judging each other. And again, he's talking to Christians here. He's talking about fighting within the Christian church. He's talking about fighting within the brotherhood. He says, don't fight with each other. Don't argue with each other. If this happens, you're separating yourself from God again because you're putting yourself in God's shoes. There's the pride again. There's our problem again. What Jesus said about it was this. Do not judge so that you will not be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged. And by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye and not notice the log in your own eye? When you're condemning someone in an argument, when you are impassioned, inflamed, annoyed, angry at someone else because of their behavior, you remember that God says there's no difference between calling someone a fool and murder? That's a pretty high standard for your behavior. I know I'm guilty of that at times. Somebody acts the fool and I call them out on it. That's judging. That's not what I'm called to do. And Jesus said, why would you look at this tiny little speck and get condemning on somebody else when your condemnation in and of itself is a log in your eye? Don't do that. James is saying the same thing, especially amongst the fellowship of the brotherhood. Now, 13 through 17, this is the final section. 17 is the last verse in James chapter 4. And he says, come now, you will say, today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business and make a big profit. Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. In your pride, you say, this is what I'm going to do. And God says, really? You can see the future. You know what's going to happen. You are just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. We are just a whisper in time. So why would we take so much pride to say, I know exactly what I'm going to be able to do. I know what I'm going to do forward. James again is attacking pride here. And our faithlessness comes when we start saying, I'm going to do what I want to do. Instead you want to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. You boast in your arrogance by saying, I'm going to do what I want to do. Instead of saying, God, is this what you want me to do? Who do you look for as motivation for your behavior and your actions and your decisions and your choices in life? Who do you ask for advice from? Is it from God? Do you go to him and say, what should I do in this situation, God? Or do you go to yourself or your friends or somebody who you know is going to agree with you? We all do that, right? If I'm going to have a discussion about somebody, I've got a disagreement going with person A, I'm person B, and I'm disagreeing with them. If I want to complain about that, I'm not going to talk to somebody who's going to agree with A. I'm going to talk to somebody who agrees with me. We do that. We want affirmation. And he's saying, don't look for self-affirmation. Don't do this on your own. Don't do this from your own mind. Do this from what God tells you to do. If God says you're wrong, you're wrong. I don't care how many people say it's right, you're wrong. Don't go off of your own pride. And in the end, this all wraps together. 17, again, it starts with therefore. What does therefore say? Therefore, to one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is a sin. He could have put this verse at the beginning of the chapter. This could have been the title of the verse, of the entire chapter. Because everything he said here is nothing new to us. As believers, these are not new things. As believers, this is stuff we should already know. And yet James has to say it again. And in the end, he ties it together and says, okay, this is everything I've been talking about. You know better. How many times did you hear that from your parents? You did something when you were a kid, and they would say, you know better than that. Happened to me. I raised my own hand here. Happened to me. And when they say that, do you not? Yeah, you can't disagree with that. When they say that, you know they're right. Yep. You can't argue that at all. And James is saying the same thing goes with God. You know better. If you're doing it, knowing you shouldn't do it, that is sin. Period. And he just talked about the separation that comes from sin. Until we humble ourselves and come back, that's a separation. The last thing you want is God to wash his hands for you. So, application, how do we do this in our lives? Well, first of all, you got to be honest when you look in that mirror. You got to be honest about what you see and what you hear and what you think and what you speak and your activities and your business and everything you do. Be honest about it. Be honest about yourself, who you are. If you're honest about yourself and you hold it up to the standard God provided for us, if we hold that up to his standard, you'll know right from wrong right there in the spot. The challenge that we get from James and the challenge that we have in life is to do it before we act and not after. After, you're going to be moaning and mourning and downtrodden because you realize you sinned against God. That's why James says, if you know the right thing and don't do it, then it's sin. If you know the right thing and you stop and you think about it, because that's why God gave us the Bible, that's why God gave us the Word, and so that we can consult that, then we're going to do the right thing and not the wrong thing. So when I look at the world and I look at everything going on around us and I look at all the things that the media is portraying, the constant separation, the constant yelling, the constant finger pointing, the looting, the protesting, the anger, the people saying this person's wrong and this person's right, all those other things going on, we know better. In this country, we know better. This country has been blessed by God more than any country on the face of this earth. And we are letting it all go. We are letting it all slip away from us. We are willfully, intentionally walking away from God right now. So all these things that James talked about, speaking with the church, and what I talked to you about today, I want you to incorporate that into your personal life. I want you to put that in your own life. I want you to hold everything up to the bright light of what God says. Number one. And number two, I beg you, please pray for this country. Because without God, we're not coming back from this. God has to step in and put his hand on us. And to do that, we got to go to him and ask. With the right motivation. We shouldn't be asking God, I don't like the fact that my neighbor's got a new pickup instead of me. Would you please let him hit a cow on the way home from work? We know that would be wrong, right? Think about our politicians and what they say about each other. Are they not hoping the guy crashes into a cow on the way home from work? We need to get away from that. We need to be bigger than that. That's not who we are. That's not who we are as Christians. That's not what this should be as a Christian nation. That's not who we are intended to be. So I just ask that you pray about that, and you pray for a revival, and do your part to bring it about in this country. Let's pray.